Imagine the shock of a single signature changing everything in an instant. That is exactly what happened when Princess Anne pulled off one of the most quietly brutal power moves in modern royal history. And the fact that nobody saw it coming is honestly the most interesting part of this whole thing. This wasn't a public statement or a carefully leaked story to a friendly newspaper. This was a single signature on a document inside a private palace office that instantly changed who controls one of the late Queen's most personal estates. And the fallout was immediate. Within hours, according to basically every royal commentator who has touched this story, the phones were ringing off the hook. Senior court officials were locked out of the loop. And the people who thought they had a permanent seat at the table suddenly realized the table had been moved without them. The person who ended up with the keys to this particular kingdom was Catherine, Princess of Wales. And the people who were left standing outside in the cold, well, that is where the whole thing gets genuinely complicated. Because it's not just about land. It's about who the late Queen's family trusted to carry her legacy forward. And apparently the answer to that question made some people absolutely furious. Princess Anne has spent her entire public life building a reputation around one thing: duty. She doesn't do drama, she doesn't do leaks. She doesn't do the whole whisper network thing that so much of palace life seems to run on. She shows up, she does the work, she goes home. That has been her brand for decades. So when she made this decision about Queen Elizabeth's private estate, it landed with the kind of weight that only comes from someone who has never once been accused of acting impulsively. The estate itself is not just some random piece of property. This is the place where Queen Elizabeth went to actually breathe, to step away from the crown for a minute and just exist as a person. Every garden path, every cottage, every timber in the main house was touched by her direct choices. This was her sanctuary, and for years there had been what you might call quiet assumptions about who would end up in control of it. Certain factions within the palace had basically operated as if the property would naturally flow toward whoever was closest to the current reign. Plans were drafted. Future events were envisioned. Private arrangements were discussed. Everyone just sort of assumed the traditional power structures would hold. Princess Anne looked at all of that and apparently said, absolutely not. The moment the document was placed on that table, and Anne pressed her signet ring into the sealing wax, the entire assumed inheritance structure collapsed. There were no preliminary committee meetings, no advisory board reviews, no subtle leaks to test public reaction. She moved with what insiders have described as absolute precision, cutting through layers of court bureaucracy to execute something that felt less like a property transfer and more like a declaration. And the person she chose was Catherine. Not because Catherine demanded it, not because she was the loudest voice in the room, but because in Anne's assessment, Catherine represents the future chapter of this institution. That is the logic, that is the reasoning. And honestly, when you lay it out like that, it makes a certain kind of sense. Why would you entrust the late Queen's personal sanctuary to anyone other than the person who will actually be guiding the monarchy forward? But here is where it gets messy, because not everyone saw it that way. The reaction from Camilla's wider circle was by all accounts volcanic, and I want to be careful here because a lot of this comes from what royal commentators have pieced together through sources and insider accounts. But the picture that emerges is one of genuine shock and fury. These were people who believed their proximity to the throne guaranteed them a voice in decisions like this. They had spent months, in some cases years, cultivating influence and negotiating access to private royal lands. They had made promises behind closed doors based on the assumption that the established order would be respected. And then Princess Anne sat down, signed a piece of paper, and rendered all of it completely irrelevant. The sense of betrayal in that room must have been overwhelming. You don't shatter an antique teacup over good news, right? That detail, the porcelain hitting the parquet floor, that is the kind of thing that only happens when someone realizes the game they thought they were playing doesn't exist anymore. What makes this so fascinating from the outside is that the anger doesn't seem to be about the land itself. Like, let's be real, Camilla's family isn't exactly struggling. This isn't about acres or building values or agricultural revenue. It is about relevance. It is about the dawning realization that their authority is tied to the present moment, to this specific reign, and that the future belongs to people who aren't them. Catherine's authority, on the other hand, is tied to something that can't be negotiated or politicked away. She's going to be queen. That's not a maybe. That's not a we'll see how things shake out. That is the actual future of the institution. And Princess Anne just made it clear that when it comes to protecting Queen Elizabeth's personal legacy, the future matters more than the present. Now the timeline here is worth paying attention to because this wasn't a snap decision. According to the accounts that have emerged, Princess Anne had been sitting on concerns for a while. She had apparently identified a growing network of private commercial interests that were starting to encroach upon the estate's boundaries. We are talking about outside figures who saw the property not as a sanctuary, but as an asset, something that could be developed or leveraged or parceled out over time. And Anne's calculation was brutally simple. If the estate stayed tied to the shifting personal influences around the current reign, it would eventually be stripped of its meaning. The only way to protect it permanently was to put it in hands that couldn't be moved, couldn't be pressured, and couldn't be outmaneuvered. Catherine was the only person who checked all those boxes. She has the public trust, she has the generational stability, and she is not going anywhere. But the real twist, the thing that takes us from palace drama to something genuinely remarkable, is what the legal team found when they started digging through the archives. Because once the initial shock wore off and Camilla's circle started making noise about challenging the transfer, researchers went looking for any precedent or loophole that might help their case. What they found instead was a small red leather envelope at the bottom of a file box, sealed with royal wax and dated years before any of this conflict began. Inside was a codicil, a legal addendum written in Queen Elizabeth's own handwriting, and the contents basically rendered every objection moot before it was even raised. The late Queen had not only anticipated this exact situation, she had already decided how it should be handled. The estate was designated as an unalterable sanctuary for the future of the crown, permanently shielded from claims by extended family or temporary court factions. Catherine wasn't just Anne's choice. She was Queen Elizabeth's choice, documented and sealed and waiting for the right moment to be executed. That is the detail that changes everything. Because up until that discovery, the people fighting against this transfer could frame it as a power play, as Princess Anne overstepping, as a sudden move that hadn't been properly considered. But once that envelope was opened, the argument collapsed completely. You can't claim you're defending the late Queen's wishes when the late Queen's actual words contradict everything you are saying. You can't argue about precedent when the precedent was set by the monarch herself in a document nobody bothered to check for. Every accusation, every protest, every media leak questioning Catherine's elevation, all of it ran straight into the wall of Queen Elizabeth's explicit final directive. The legal structure was ironclad, the decision was final, and everyone who had spent weeks raging against it suddenly had to confront the reality that they weren't fighting Princess Anne at all. They were fighting a plan that had been set in motion years ago by a woman who knew exactly what would happen after she was gone. The strategic brilliance of Anne's move becomes clearer the more you look at it. She didn't just transfer property, she created an impenetrable barrier around it. By putting Catherine in control with this kind of legal backing, she made it functionally impossible for commercial interests or shifting court factions to ever touch the estate. Catherine is the future queen. Her position isn't dependent on who is currently in favor or who has the king's ear. She is beyond that. And Anne recognized that protecting Queen Elizabeth's sanctuary required placing it beyond the reach of palace politics entirely. That's not a petty maneuver. That's long-term institutional thinking from someone who has spent her entire life watching how these things actually work. For Catherine, the weight of this is hard to overstate. She's not celebrating. She's not doing a victory lap. The accounts describe her sitting quietly with the estate plans, reviewing agricultural reports and conservation proposals, fully aware that every decision she makes from this point forward will be scrutinized by people waiting for her to fail. Walking those tree-lined paths where Queen Elizabeth once sought solitude, the responsibility settles in a way that probably can't be fully explained to anyone outside that world. This isn't a gift, it's a trust, and she seems to understand that completely. Prince William, for his part, has apparently made his position absolutely clear to anyone who asked. Any attempt to undermine Catherine's appointment or challenge Princess Anne's authority will be met with total resistance. He watched his grandmother build this sanctuary, he knows what it meant to her, and he has zero intention of letting anyone carve it up for their own benefit. The message from that quarter is unambiguous. This is done, this is right, and this is not up for debate. The broader implications here are worth thinking about. This transfer signals a shift that goes beyond one property. It is a changing of the guard, a quiet but unmistakable declaration. Silent influence is drawing to a close. The future of the monarchy is William and Catherine, and decisions like this make that reality harder to ignore or delay. Princess Anne, by acting when she did and how she did, basically forced the institution to look forward instead of sideways. She took the internal storm on herself so that William and Catherine could step into their future without compromised legacies trailing behind them. That's not just loyalty. That's strategic sacrifice from someone who has never asked for credit and probably never will. The people who lost this fight, and it's hard to call it anything other than a loss at this point, are now in an impossible position. They can't continue opposing the transfer without directly defying Queen Elizabeth's documented final wishes. They can't frame it as a rogue action by Princess Anne without looking like they didn't do their homework. And they can't argue that Catherine is unworthy or unprepared without attacking the judgment of both the late Queen and one of the most respected working royals in modern history. The silence that followed the archive discovery tells you everything you need to know. The power struggle ended not with a public confrontation, but with a piece of paper that had been sitting in a file box for years waiting for exactly this moment. What sticks with me about this whole situation is how clearly it illustrates the difference between influence and authority. Camilla's circle had influence, they had access, they had proximity, they had the ability to make things happen through quiet conversations and implied expectations. But Catherine now has authority, the kind that is written down, legally binding, and backed by the explicit instructions of a monarch who planned for this long before anyone else was thinking about it. Influence can be lost, shifted, or outmaneuvered. Authority, real authority, is much harder to dislodge, and Princess Anne understood that distinction better than anyone in that palace. The late queen's handwriting on those pages, the specific conditions she outlined, the clarity of her vision for who should protect the sanctuary and why, all of it points to a level of foresight that's genuinely striking. She knew the tensions that would arise. She knew which people would push and which people would try to redirect things for their own benefit, and instead of hoping it would work itself out, she left instructions. Specific, binding, legally enforceable instructions that sat quietly in an archive until the exact moment they were needed. That's not just wisdom. That's a masterclass in protecting what matters from beyond the grave. For Camilla's family and the wider circle that had built expectations around this estate, the reckoning is probably still settling in. The quiet influence they had cultivated, the carefully negotiated access, the subtle promises made in private conversations, all of it dissolved the moment that red wax seal was broken. There's no appeal process for this. There's no workaround. The late queen made her choice. Princess Anne executed it, and Catherine now carries it forward. Anyone who wants to keep fighting has to explain why they think they know better than Queen Elizabeth herself. Good luck with that argument. Princess Anne's role in all of this is the thing I keep coming back to. She didn't have to do this. She could have let the chips fall where they may, let the estate get pulled into whatever commercial or political currents were swirling around the current reign, and nobody would have blamed her for staying out of it. Instead, she stepped directly into the line of fire, took the backlash, absorbed the anger, and made sure the outcome was locked in before anyone could stop it. She acted as a shield so that William and Catherine wouldn't have to fight this battle themselves. That's duty in its purest form. No press release, no photo op, no carefully managed public image. Just a signature on a document and a willingness to stand behind it no matter who got upset. The image of Catherine walking those quiet paths, understanding that she is now responsible for preserving something that meant everything to the late queen, that is the emotional core of the story. It's not about winning. It's not about defeating rivals or proving points. It's about accepting a weight that someone else chose you to carry and carrying it with the dignity the responsibility demands. Queen Elizabeth built this sanctuary as a place of peace. Catherine's job now is to make sure it stays that way for the next generation and the one after that. Given everything we have seen from her over the years, the steady focus, the refusal to get dragged into petty conflicts, the quiet dedication to the work itself, it is hard to imagine anyone better suited to the task. Years from now, when historians look back at this period, they probably won't spend much time on the private meetings or the shattered teacups or the frantic phone calls between palace offices. What they will see is the moment Princess Anne made a choice that protected Queen Elizabeth's legacy from becoming just another asset to be traded and leveraged. They will see a decision that prioritized the future over the present and permanence over convenience. And they will see Catherine, Princess of Wales, standing on ground that was entrusted to her not because of politics or favoritism, but because 2 generations of royal women looked at her and saw someone who would protect what mattered. The factions can keep whispering, the speculation can keep swirling, but the foundation underneath all of it is solid. Princess Anne made sure of that, and somewhere you have to think Queen Elizabeth knew exactly what she was doing when she left those instructions behind. She understood the personalities, the pressures, and the quiet battles that would inevitably unfold once she was no longer there to oversee things directly. That small red leather envelope wasn't just a legal safeguard. It was a message from the past delivered at precisely the right moment, reminding everyone that even in absence her will would hold, and it did.